Hello and welcome to Same Old News with your host, Josh. Episode 6. Empire in the News. Hello once again and welcome to Same Old News, the show which dissects the press and news of the past and tries to find links to the present. Well, the election results in the UK have come flying in a couple of days ago, and it is a very interesting set of results with a Labour landslide victory. The big headline, though, being the collapse of the now former Conservative government, with many big Conservative names losing their seats. But we also have the rise of reform, which is... I haven't really got a word to use here, to be honest. I would dare to say I shudder at that result. And on top of this, the press and the media have done a lot in that success for reform, giving them tons of airtime and outside of maybe Channel 4, not properly scrutinising them and their members' alleged statements, which got them thrown out of the party's campaign. Anyway, I could go on for a while on this election results, but I only have so much time with this podcast episode, so let's just get into the actual topic of this episode today. The press and its connection to empire in the period 1780 to 1830. Now, for transparency, this script is based off of a section of a literature review draft that I just submitted to my supervisors for review. I have made some alterations to it to make it flow better, and also got rid of some other things which were very in-depth and for the purposes of this episode would be unnecessary information. So, with that out of the way, one key element to discuss with regards to the press and politics in Britain in this period is the inextricable link Britain has to its colonies and the wider world, especially through colonial press sources. During this period, English-language newspapers were being established in colonies across the British Empire as far away as the American colonies in Canada, all the way to Australia. But what was their influence, if any, in this period? And how do we actually go about analysing them in relation to Britain? That's what we hope to answer in today's episode. So, firstly, did the imperial press of the late 18th and early 19th century, or even the existence of empire itself, actually influence readers in the British Isles? Many scholars and historians have expanded the discussion of British politics in the late Georgian period to beyond the borders of Britain itself. This is not just in the case of responses to the American Revolution, mind you. It was even in the halls of Westminster itself. Colonies had influence and representation within the House of Commons. There was a not insignificant number of MPs representing the interests of the West Indies and the East India Company. Miles Taylor's analysis of the 1830s reform crisis shows that the big parties included intense discussion of empire and where it stood in relation to reform, especially with the 1832 Reform Act. Then when we zoom out from Westminster, political discussion included empire in an interdependent relationship. In the context of corruption, scholars like Mark Knights have shown domestic debates and reform led to a notion of British moral and political superiority. With that, there was an aim to spread that reform to the empire and beyond. But one other way of understanding the influence of empire on the British domestic population would be through cultural forms. The central debate on the influence of empire in British culture has focused on the late Victorian period and whether the British population was both aware and influenced by it. But this leaves out the discussion of everything before the Victorian period. I personally think it was as early as the Georgian period. Kathleen Wilson, on top of this, argues the increased interest in print and other literary works read by the population had an influence in spreading news and ideas of empire alongside other sources of information. Colonial press sources were important in this regard in the increasing knowledge of the empire and development of a British self-identity. If you want to read more on the concept of the British self-identity, I would really recommend that you read Linda Colley's work on this. It's very good. However, the issue with focusing solely on the colonial press's influence on Britain itself is that it neglects to break down the politics of colonialism. As many global and new imperial historians have shown, focusing on Britain in relation to empire legitimizes imperial structures of metropole and periphery. Post-colonial theory has worked really well to break down this invented barrier between the quote-unquote metropole and the quote-unquote periphery. To get a better understanding of the influence of empire and the colonial press sources, therefore, would require Britain to be decentered from these imperial structures. This would mean seeing Britain as one constituent part of the empire and reliant on their colonies. It was not in complete control, even if British officials wanted to see it that way. Britain was dependent on its empire for the economy, the same empire that was exploited for its resources by those Brits. While the press in the colonies would work its way back to Britain, this neglects exploring where those papers fit into the politics of their respective colonies and the development of ideologies such as conservatism across the empire, which is what I'm focusing on in my thesis. But since I'm focusing on conservatism, it's not just limited to that ideology. The empire caused reinterpretations of all ideologies, and religion was also central in this. But all political groups formed an image of empire based on what information they had access to, and which they were getting from those colonies and beyond. Analysing how information moved across the empire in this period would also refocus analysis onto a global British press. So we've established that the empire in general had an influence, and people were very much aware of this in the late Georgian period. So the imperial press is something we do need to focus on, how it informs those opinions of empire. But historical writing of the newspaper press and media of this period in the empire has been lacking, in my opinion. The histories of the press in the British colonies of this period have suffered from Whig interpretations of the English-speaking colonial press. Hold on, hold on, wait a minute. What the hell is the Whig interpretation? What do I mean by the Whig interpretation? Well, it's a good thing you asked that question, because it's time for a quick academic history lesson. The Whig interpretation is a view of British political history that originated from the mid-19th century. The term itself is coined by historian Herbert Butterfield in 1931, when he himself was actually criticising it. Whig historians push an interpretation of this period that is all about progress, constitutional reforms, growing freedoms and liberty for the people and the press towards a more enlightened political scene. So, in a word, modernisation. This is utter rubbish. Oh, that was offensive, apparently. Director, how do I rephrase it without the canned gasping coming back? Oh, okay, so just be more polite, even if it is a near 200-year-old historical theory that is clearly wrong. I see, okay. Let's phrase it like this then. This is generally accepted as wrong theory nowadays, and most historians have rejected this view, but I think it's still going. It's just a bit more subtle. And this is not just in the case of British politics, but also with histories of the colonial press. Now, I'd say that histories of the press in the Caribbean are a notable exception to this. Research on the Caribbean press has seen a concerted effort to analysing pro-slavery writing and pro-slavery networks, as well as their impact across the empire and back to Britain. There's been numbers of publications in articles, books, PhD theses, the list goes on. However, the historiography of the early colonial presses in places such as Cape Colony in India, places that I'm actually dedicating a lot of research on, show a deeper focus on liberal newspapers and the fight for freedom of the press in those respective colonies. In the Indian press, most recent work has followed this trend. Narrative discussions of Indian newspapers has given so much more focus to Hickey's Bengal Gazette and James Silk Buckingham's Calcutta Journal and their work to challenge the East India Company's Bengal government, as well as their imposed limits on freedom of the press. Andrew Otis's very in-depth work on Hickey's Bengal Gazette, which is, by the way, a paper in production between the years 1780 to 1782, as well as being a radical paper, goes very much in depth and gives some exploration of Hickey's rival, the India Gazette, and its sponsorship by the Bengal government, to show a contrast in the Indian press of the time. But that rivalry lasted about 10 pages in Otis's work. The rest is dedicated to the publisher, James Augustus Hickey, and describes the contrast as similar to the Whig-Tory split in England, with Hickey representing the more liberal press. Highlighting Hickey as well as Buckingham's Calcutta Journal, though, does not provide an accurate or clear image of the British press in India in this period, even if most historians like to focus on them. In reality, as David Finkelstein and Douglas Pearce have shown, most work has emphasised the press, and I'm going to quote here, quote, unproblematically within a liberal paradigm, end quote. This is in spite of the reality of most newspapers in India being a lot more conforming to the Bengal government. The India Gazette that I mentioned earlier, the Calcutta Gazette, John Bull in the East, just to name a few. And this pattern repeats itself once we get to Cape Colony. John Mackenzie's work in 2006 of the press in Cape Colony analysed it in the sense of Scottish printers and their spread of Enlightenment ideals being pitted against Governor Somerset's Toryism and autocracy. The focus of historians has been on the work of Thomas Pringle and John Fairbairn in their printing of the South Africa Journal and the South African Commercial Advertiser. Pringle specifically has received much attention in research. His, though, is an interesting case, since before he came to Cape Colony he worked with Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, which was a Tory paper, and was also an admirer of Sir Walter Scott, a very notable Tory writer of the day. Even though in the Cape he became a major reformist voice, which he continued when he came back to Britain, joining the cause for the abolition of slavery. But with all of this, there were multiple papers which were conservative-minded or pro-government in the Cape itself. The Cape Town Gazette, the Grahamstown Journal, as well as the South Africa Chronicle and Mercantile Advertiser. The historiography of the Cape and Indian papers from this period show that there has been an intense focus on the liberal press and not on their conservative rivals. This requires a reappraisal of the press landscape in British colonies of this period to analyse the more conservative papers and their influence specifically, and not just wrap it all up into freedom of the press discussions again, as we spoke about earlier with the Whig interpretation. What we need to ask then is how to measure the influence of those conservative papers or any newspaper in general in an imperial context. These examples of conservative-minded papers show not only the viability of analysing conservative press sources in British colonies, it also presents new opportunities to analyse the movements of conservatism and other ideologies in global movements across imperial networks. So what do I mean by global movements and imperial networks? Well, the use of global historical methodologies of connections and networks look to show a global system of movements of people, information, material goods, etc., etc. Now, the mere existence of global connections in themselves are not enough, according to Sebastian Conrad. Rather, they need to be understood through the structures that facilitated them, in this case imperialism. This needs to be considered when discussing movements of newspapers, whether conservative or not. And imperial networks allow us to do this. And historians have been doing this. They, though, don't just look at one colony. They look across and even outside the empire itself. This is now going to be me just naming people and their research, so I do apologise if this bit's a bit boring. Alan Lester has explored the use of networks as a method of analysis to analyse how colonial discourses in one colony would develop across an imperial network which morphs and changes those discourses. Tony Ballantyne's work has expanded on this analysis to suggest the use of a specific methodology to trace these discourses. He uses what he calls webs, that he says transcends the borders of the British Empire. This allows historians to decenter the imperial metropole in their analysis and show its dependence on the empire as a whole. However, Zoe Laidlaw disagrees with the use of webs and prefers to use networks as her subject of analysis. She argues that her methodology addresses the fact that different networks are uneven in terms of their power structure, especially considering the directions of the network between colonies or between metropole and colony. The use of imperial networks is useful in this regard when analysing the press from a global perspective. It allows for discourses to be traced and analysed across these imperial networks, while not confining them to national or colonial boundaries. This is especially important for any ideological movement. Think of it like this. In order to visualise this, let's say an opinion, which is conservative, starts in colonial Bengal under the power of the East India Company in present-day Kolkata. An opinion is stated here in a certain newspaper or even in a printed work. This will then move around. The book or paper may work its way down to Australia, and then down to also Cape Colony at the same time. What you will then see in these two other spaces is that different interpretations will come about depending on how they read it. And then those interpretations are then going to move around themselves, maybe go back to the original source, but maybe go to the Caribbean or to London. This is how we mean. There's different spaces, different points in the network, and information and people are moving between these different points in the network at all times. And this means that ideas and people will change with how they move across that network. Now I want to move on to my final consideration, and I'll warn that this is the one that is the hardest to nail down and simplify. So I promise I'm going to try my best. The final issue that needs to be considered is that of the concept of space, especially when dealing with multiple points in an imperial network like we just visualised earlier. Ideologies and political opinions will not be the same across all points of an imperial network, and are going to be informed by the discourses and individuals that move within and between these points. The late Doreen Massey is very important in this discussion, the foremost name in discussing the concept of space. Massey sees space as a constantly changing concept, quote, a product of relations, embedded material practices which have to be carried out. It is always in the process of being made, end quote. This understanding of space has been applied into imperial network theory as well in those historians that I previously mentioned. But the idea of the movement of people within an imperial network has also had an influence on those imperial spaces. David Lambert and Alan Lester have shown that individuals careering between different spaces would bring their identities and ideas with them, and those would shift and change in these new locations and spaces. Where this can be seen as useful in the context of the press, particularly in my research on the conservative press, is with the movements of editors and writers, but also the movements of their newspapers. Ideas would move across imperial spaces, whether through newspapers or in the identity of an individual editor or contributor. There is a flexibility in that the identities and ideas of individual writers are continually moving even if they themselves are not. Ben Gilding showed this in a 2019 article on Hickey's Bengal Gazette, showing how it can be applied to newspapers as well as their publishers and contributors. Understanding space as a constantly changing and influencing concept allows for a more flexible understanding of ideologies and their mouthpieces in the press, shaping ideas in Britain itself and across the British Empire. So, that was a theory-heavy bit to end on today, and don't worry if you feel dizzy, we are back on solid ground now, don't worry. I get confused by it at times as well, so do not worry. But anyway, this is what I think we need to consider when analysing the press in the empire of the late Georgian period. We need to push past old interpretations of Whig histories of politics or sticking to imperial structures of metropole and periphery by decentering Britain. It requires thinking in newer, more innovative ways. How people and ideas move and change with space and time. And this is just as prevalent for newspapers and editors, especially with my research topic, conservatism and the press in the late Georgian period. Empire cannot be ignored, and the newspapers of this period were fully aware of this, so much so that you see a large network of colonial newspapers talking to each other in this period. But that means we'll always have one final question in our minds. Even if we decenter Britain, there's people that are going to still ask that same question. Were these newspapers and press sources actually influencing anything going on in Britain politically in this period? And in a one-word answer, yes. Yeah, they were. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Same Old News. Next time we will be combining some of episode 5 as well as this episode to see what was British politics actually looking like in this period for those observing it at the time. If you enjoyed, please give a like or a review depending on where it is that you are listening. Also, do check out our social medias in the description of this episode to keep up to date with new episodes and other content. I can promise that a different form of content is coming to the YouTube channel very soon. Ooh, excitement indeed. But I'm not going to spoil that for now. Anyway, with all that said, I shall speak soon and stay tuned for the Same Old News. Thank you for listening. One for a start.